this is a good little illustration of what you can do with a piece of music. I had a commercial, and usually there's several figures animating in it. And I had a cow walk through. I believe this was advertising condensed milk or whatever it was. But we had this goofy cow. This is out in New York City after I had left Disney. Went back with UPA. The cow, I took the 12 beat, and then I analyzed every possible beat you could pick out of a 12. You could divide it into 6, you could divide it into 2, you could divide it into 3. 3 goes into 12. So I had the tail going, I think, on 6s, performing a little loop. I had the 12 bounce on the cat, or on the cow with the stomach bouncing up. The bell was about on 2s around her neck. And there was a little, probably a 4 bounce to the neck, just a little one. So you had all of these bounces. Then my assistant, who was Tisa Davy at that time, maybe some of you have heard of her. She's developed into a very excellent animator. She took all of these different elements, and first she traced the 12 bodies, and then put on the tail, which was in a loop of 6, and put all these different, some of them she had to trace 3 times, or maybe 4 times. But then you had an animal that had everything moving, all of the different beats. That's what you can do with the beat, but it took years to learn. I think I did more experimental animation in commercials than I ever did at Disney's or any other studio. Of course, when I had Disney's, particularly on the Snow White, everything was very carefully worked out. The beat was there, the voice was there. You had to animate to it. And of course, with the Snow White character, there were no chances at all. And incidentally, I think half of these scenes we saw tonight never got into the picture. Parts of that pencil test, I don't know how Reg ever got hold of it. Must have robbed the bank.
You're not going to ask him.
That was Bill Title's animation. I think you've all heard of Bill. You've all read the Disney books, and he was a Ukrainian that came over. That Bill, I guess, he may have been born in his country. If he wasn't, he came from a Ukrainian family, and of course, he had to live up to his gallantry as a horse rider, so he joined the Disney polo team. One rainy day, his horse slipped and landed on Bill, and he was in a stretcher in a hospital for about 7 months. He never played polo again.
Grim, were Frank Thomas and Mark Davis there then?
Frank Thomas and Mark Davis was my #1 assistant most of the time at Disney. So I started out with a fellow named Jack Campbell, who was an excellent artist. But he got eager to animate, and he moved in with the Ham Lusk group. And Mark took his place, and Mark, fortunately for me, he was one of the greatest artists that was ever in the animation business, so we got along great. And in Snow White, I finally had Les Novros and 3 others. I had 5 assistants. We were eventually turning out, at the end, toward the end of the work, we were turning out 35 feet a week, which was tremendous footage on a character that kind. I was at a showing of Milt Call's tests for the rescuers, and somebody asked Milt how many feet he turned out. He said between 7 and 10 feet a week. So 35 feet was a tremendous amount on a character like Snow White. Well, I have said a lot of jumbled things here.
Maybe they have some more questions.
Do you have any questions?
Oh, yeah. You worked a lot with iWorks, and I'd just like to know what it was like to work with him, the kind of person that he was, the kind of things that he did.
Yeah, well, Ub was possibly, if you wanted someone to, if Christ hadn't been able to get into the place at the time when you substituted up Iwerks, you'd have a pretty good substitute. He was a great guy. I don't think there was a dishonest bone in his body, but he was a tremendous dreamer, a tremendous and inventive. He built. I eventually took over for him in the studio. Fortunately for me, about half his staff came out from the Flasher studio, and some of them have been my assistants, so we got along very nicely. And I went down to the basement of this building and built a multiple-plane camera horizontally about 3 years before Disney built his. He was a fantastic mind. I learned a great deal about animation, particularly the ways to save animation. That brings us back to this point I mentioned at the opening of the repeating of action. I remember the first scene I animated there. We never bothered out at Flashers. We just grab a scene and animate it and throw it into the camera room, and it was shot, and we forgot about it. Iwerks, I had this pair dancing. They danced across the scene, and I said, "What do we do now, I hadn't finished out this track. You want to put some gags in here?" "No," he said, "turn them over and dance them the other way. Just expose them the back." Which, of course, it left it up to the inkers. Well, I'd never thought of a thing like that. It wasn't cheating. It was the way the smart animators were working those days. If you could double your footage without making a drawing, it was worth doing. But, and he was an excellent artist. He would knock out a cute little character. I remember one story, I think it was the Pied Piper of Hamelin or something, and he sat down at my desk and drew a lot of lousy-looking rats with big teeth and long noses. He said, "That is a real drawing lesson." He was a fantastic artist, but he was so inventive. The last time I talked to him, I used to see him occasionally over at the Disney studio. You all know that he eventually went back there. And he told me he was, as a matter of fact, we were up at Ub's house. Merle Gilson, who was one of the, you'll see his picture in the earliest picture of the Disney's. He was one of the first 10 or 12 people at the Disney studio, and he worked with Ub and drew the Ub Mickey just exactly the way Ub did in those days, which is not very much the way the mouse is today. And we visited Ub. He eventually had worked with it. As a matter of fact, he came over with Ub when Ub started the studio. And Ub said he was then working on a mechanical device, a computer device that would operate the camera while the cameraman went out to lunch. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough.
I was going to ask you, how old was he when he died?
I think in his 60s. I saw he was in his 60s somewhere. He was not a drunkard. He was not a dissipator. He was King Liver. But I think that he probably put in too many 14-hour days and loved it. And just the Constitution didn't take it.
May I ask something? What about all the rumors that you hear about Iwerks and Disney not speaking after he came back?
Oh, that's very probable. They were both. Well, after he came back.
After he came back to the Disney studio.
I talked to Ub once in his Disney office afterwards, and let's see, how did he word that? I may not be wording it. I may not giving Ub credit for his native politeness, but it seems to me that I asked him about waltz, and what he he seems to have said is that he's a grouchy old son of a bitch or something. But I would qualify that because I wasn't a gifted gent when he came to colloquialism at a particular standard. He was quite a gentleman.
But it was true that they were not friends.
I've asked that question many times. As a matter of fact, I had a 3/4 of an hour talk over the telephone 3 days ago, wasn't it? You probably couldn't guess if all of it took 10 guesses. It was Ray Disney.
The day before yesterday, I think it was.
And he sold us insurance in the studio. All of us had to take automobile insurance.
All in the family.
And every time Walt took a trip to England, he had to take $1 million policy. He told me on the telephone, well, in 3/4 of an hour, you can say a great deal. One thing he told me was that he now was worth $5 million, and told me that Roy's son inherited $60 million, and things like that, which are silly things to talk about. I know none of you would ever do anything like that. But Ray, well, I knew Ray quite well because even after I'd left the studio and after I'd moved out to New York, I still carried my automobile insurance with him, and used to pop over to his house once in a while. He had an excellent 5-cent cigar that he always offered me, and a drink of imported scotch. What?
I said he probably still smokes a 5-cent cigar.
Yeah, he always, he did drink good whiskey. I remember, well, you saw the last bottle that I brought over from his house. It said on it, "No finer whiskey made in the world." And I guess it was very, very fine.
Well, I have to tell you that I was sitting on a
Oh yes, that's how I happened to know that he was still
I
alive.
was sitting on a bus bench one day, and this old gentleman walked up, and he talked a little while, and he said, "Would you like to know who I am?" Well, I didn't really, but I said, "Sure, I would." And he said, "I'm Ray Disney." And then he handed me about a half a dozen little plastic things advertising Ray Disney Insurance. And a little comb and a little coin purse. But did he tell you anything about Abbi Works the other day? Did you?
Not a word, no. But from all that he said, and I don't think that he's strictly honest. Apparently, Walt and his brother were set up for a pistol fight all the time, and somebody talked them out of it. But I never saw Walt lose his temper, and I bowled on the same team. Well, actually, Roy, who was the business head of the thing, there were about 36 of us, a big bowling squad, and we went down once a week and bowled, and he was captain of one of the teams. He wasn't the greatest bowler on the team, but he bowled for fun. Later on, I worked at Universal, and we were having our tournament bowling one night in an alley in the neighborhood where Roy Disney lived, and he came in with his son to do some bowling, and we chatted a minute. So he didn't just bowl to say Roy Disney bowls with the team, with the animators, which were not scum, by the way. He paid Norton Ferguson, and at the time that I started with Disney, he paid him the highest salary, which was $315 a week. That was a very good salary at that time, particularly in the strata of artists. However, the highest paid artists in the country at that time were the American illustrators. Saturday Evening Post used to pay them $2,500 for one issue, which came out every week, and for the illustrations for one issue of a continued story. And that was one reason that I studied in Europe. I wanted to bring my art information up to a point where I could become an illustrator. I knew quite a few of these illustrators. And Dean Cornwell particularly, I'd worked in a little commercial studio with him out in Chicago when I was about 20 years old. And however, the poor illustrator, he was just, the great magazines just went out of business. Television, of course, killed them. Television killed the theater showing of animation until this theater started up.
May I tell them something? I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Grim's doing. He's the busiest man in Santa Monica. He works all day long. He doesn't get up very early, but after he gets up, he works all day. He writes for Cartoonist Profile.
I guess quite a few see the Cartoonist Profile, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay, he writes for that, and he draws all the time. When he gets tired of drawing, he sits down and studies his art books. He 2 or 3 times, oh no, more than that, probably 4 times a month, he's at some place doing something for someone. 2 nights ago, or was it 3 nights? Tuesday night it was. He was at the Festival for Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, where he spoke and took one of his drawings and sold for $55, which wasn't enough, but anyway. He went to Cal Arts, where a large theater out there was packed with kids sitting in the aisles, and they gave him a standing ovation. And a week ago Saturday, he received a award from what?
Oh, fantasy films, you probably have never heard of it. I think it's a Hollywood group, 200 or 300 people.
Anyway, he's busy all the time.
Are interested in animation, primarily. They give awards every year to the most, well, fellows like Ray Bradford, fantasy films, fantasy literature, fantasy poetry,
fiction.
fantasy novels. That they consider animation in that fantasy group. That's how I happened to pick
While
one.
we're on that, why don't you tell them what Ray Bradbury told you about Toronto while you were at that?
Oh, yes.
Well, no, he didn't tell. I heard that on radio, but
Yeah.
we know Ray is devoted to animation. He's at all of our CIFA dinners.
He's a frustrated animator.
Many of our affairs, we have things that are just a CIFA thing, it's strictly animation thing. And I happened to have the radio on, and Ray Bradford was talking about the decadence of particularly American cities. Well, I was saying, I want to try to, for instance, if any of you have been in New York City recently, the underground, as they call it in London, I guess, well, they call it a subway in New York. The cars are literally desecrated with graffiti, just horrible, disgusting things. And as Bradbury said about it, someone who said he thought it was beautiful, another author who said he thought graffiti was very beautiful. Ray Bradbury said, wrong as usual, he would say that. However, what he did say about Toronto was it was the most perfectly organized city in the Western Hemisphere, which is quite a compliment. And what I've seen of it, I guess he's right. Los Angeles is an accumulation of a lot of little cities scattered around. And New York has been desecrated with this graffiti all over the town.
And Los Angeles isn't far
And
beyond.
I don't know about, I haven't been in Chicago recently, but however it is too bad what is happening to
In New
some of
York,
the cities.
it's very incongruous to see businessmen riding in these cars down Wall Street riding in the subway cars, which are completely covered with graffiti.
I hardly dared to step into one the last time I
Well,
was
they-
there,
they
which
were-
was 5 years
They were
ago.
going down in the morning when there wasn't much danger, going down to work.
I don't know how a mayor of a city would permit anything like that to happen.
I think it's very hard to stop it. Very easy to do it.
There must be a horrible mass of hoodlums. Yeah, if you have any questions, I can't answer them.
Grim,
Yeah.
right here, Reg, over here.
Oh,
You know, in that, in Jack Frost,
yeah,
with your backgrounds, I saw that on TV just after Christmas,
yeah.
the print,
Did?
and all the, you know, the nude women you did in the backgrounds on the sequence where where the old winner is chasing the
I
kid.
did nude women in
There are
it.
nude women in it. Anyway, they erased them.
Oh, did
They
they?
did?
Yeah, for television.
He makes
Probably Playboy got jealous.
It was the strangest thing because I had not noticed them before that. And I saw the cartoon on Saturday morning and it was just on and I looked at it and thought there's something wrong with that cartoon. and I dug it off the shelf and put it on and looked at it and thought, well, that's it. They played again later and they erased those new women in the background. The trees are
Probably
drawn.
the best part of the picture. Anyway, that was a picture that suffered because we had to use CineColor. We couldn't get a good orange for the pumpkins and all the way through. And I sketched all those backgrounds. I had, in studying in Vienna, I found one of the most charming places to go to sketch was in the Prado, which is a great many of, probably some of you have been in Vienna.
It's an amusement park.
It's a long streets where when I was there at least, it was just for horse and carriages on a Sunday afternoon, and old trees that are half eaten away, over some of them 400 or 500 years old. I used to, it was near where I lived, and I would walk over there and sketch these old trees. So I had a lot of fun just throwing these trees. But the background man, strange thing, he just wasn't up to catching. Because I sold every sketch I made when I came back from there. And strangely enough, later on I worked for Walter Lance at Universal, and this same background artist was on the Universal, the live action part of it, designing backgrounds for live action, and I strolled over to say hello to him one lunch hour. He said, you know, I copped that background you made for Jack Frost. I didn't have brains enough to take any of those things. It wasn't a matter of honesty. I didn't realize that kids were picking up stuff all over the place. And a single drawing that I made.
I have a question. How did you first get into the animation business, and was it typical of the way your contemporaries got into it as well?
My contemporaries, I don't know how they got it. I think most of them started in the Mutt and Jeff studio, which was really the first one. I know that my boss got into it that way. His name was Gregory Licata. If you've ever seen the feature picture Stage Door, which is often on TV, at least
I saw his
over
name in
the
the
States.
newspaper yesterday, as a matter of fact.
And Primrose Path, did you ever happen to see that feature length? He was virtually an Academy Award director of live action. He ended up that way. When I knew him, I met him in art school in Chicago. And his money ran out about the same time mine did, so he went back home in New York, and I went up into Wisconsin. And we picked up a little more change and went back to the city, and we used to correspond. And I got to doing song covers. At that time, people bought songs and took them home and sang them. There was no radio. That was pre-radio days, and of course, I could knock out a song in a day, and I made fairly good money. You'd get $10 or $15 for a song cover at that time. And the wage scale was as low as $10 a week, so I was kind of rich in a very low grade fashion. And finally, I saved enough money because most of the big music publishers in New York City at that time, and I want to tell you, they sell 3 or 4 million copies of a song they'd print, you know. Everybody had to do their own singing. And so I went to New York, and naturally I saw my friend La Cava, and as a matter of fact, I lived with him in his home for the first 2 months I was there. And he then was in charge of the international Hearst studio animation. And we'd talk about everything, and he had seen some of my songs. I used to sometimes get a comic song cover. Particularly about half the songs that in the early days were written by Negroes, and many of them I draw a comic Negro. They were not quite as touchy about.
Who was that one that, who's that word? You know, the black man with
Bert Williams, who?
no.
I knew many of these song covers. Well, maybe you think of. Anyway, La Cava just was aching. You couldn't buy. There were no animators. They all came from the newspapers, and some of them could never learn to animate. And you'd seen some of these drawings that I thought were comic, and he thought were comic, and he said, "Why don't you come in and try this? Come in and try it for 2 weeks." He started me at $40 a week, which was less than I was earning, but it was 4 times as much as the girls in Woolworth were getting. He didn't dare start a fellow who didn't know how to animate more than that, because his boss probably said, "Oh, how the hell, don't pay him anymore." So I came in and I perspired on the first job. Well, I'll describe it. It was a scene, there was a horse race scene. And this horse, a spavined old sow-backed horse, was trying a horse race, and Happy Hooligan was riding its back, and he had a syringe with cocaine in it. He kept climbing up the horse to get him to stay in the race. And La Cava made the first repeat of the drawings, you know, the 2 legs forward and picking up so that they hook. I didn't know what a hookup was. I thought, gosh, this is terrible. I tried to make a hookup and move the horse forward. I couldn't do it. All of a sudden, I saw this paper punch across there, and I got out a ruler and I measured. Those drawings were moving just about that far, about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch, you know. So I just punched a lot of holes across it, 1/8 of an inch apart, and then each time I numbered them. Each time I'd move number 1, I'd trace that. To number 2, I would move 1/8 of an inch, or move the pegs over 1/8 of an inch. Finally, it took me a week to get that horse across the scene. It was terrible. I perspired. They didn't have air conditioning in those days. I used to have to sponge off my feet. The perspiration just rolled the full length of my body. And at the end of the 2 weeks, I quit. And look, I said, "You're doing great." So the next thing I knew, the cow, he was being paid $300 a week, which was really a pretty tiny salary. And he was a nerdy little Italian kid. His father had been a shoemaker up in Rochester, and this kid just, he knew there were no animators. He knew nobody knew what he knew, you know, and he went in and asked Hearst for $600 a week. Nobody had ever heard of that kind of money, except Hearst. Hearst fired him. And La Cava told me, he came, and we were really close friends. I mean, we used to go weekends, canoe across the Hudson, take a lunch, and sit down on the bank and read Omer Khayyam, and we thought that was great. during our art student days, and before he got into this job, because I went to art school out in New York for a while with him, but I'll leave that chapter out. It's just coincidental. But what finally happened, the convict called me into his office. He said, I've been fired, and so you'll have to stay on your own. I'd only been there 2 weeks, and I didn't really know anybody else in the studio. But he said, I'll tell you what to do. Go into the boss's office. Tell him you want to take less than $100 a week. He has to have it. Doesn't matter how good you are. So I took all of the nerve that I ever, I was still in my early 20s. I was frightened, but I had a habit of leaning back and putting my hands behind my back. And I pretended I couldn't possibly afford to work for less than $100 a week. And he said, okay, I suppose if I said 200, he might have said okay. Because he knew he couldn't hire. There were no animators. So I learned how to animate. All of a sudden, I remember I had a scene where a hooligan had to come in and throw a fish line through a transom. They used to have transoms above doorways. And then all of a sudden, you've all fished, I'm sure, up here in this fishing country. And I had done Wisconsin's great fishing. And then the thing started jerking, and he started reeling in and pulled a suit of clothes through the transom and dressed up. And that was the gag. And I enjoyed it somehow or other. This repeat thing threw me, but when I could really control the drawings, of course the animation was very crude. And some of it's getting crude today, too, because kids out of art school and throw them into, there are a million little problems besides being excellent draftsmen. And then learning how the theater sense of knowing the timing, how to read a soundtrack, and then the greatest thing of all, how to expose it, how to get the meat out of it by hitting the accents, solving over them when you don't need them, and all the other, there's 2,000 little tricks that you have to learn before you pin a medal on yourself and say, I'm an animator. All right, if there are no more questions, maybe I've interrupted your program, have I?
Oh God, no, you're the program.
I've heard it 1,000 times, Reg, and I've never heard that story about the suit of clothes before.
We would be learning something new.
That's the idea.
Which artists, like you say that you study art now, and when you don't want to do anything else.
Oh, well, I'm surrounded with art books. No, I thought that I would, when I retired several years ago, but when I had been over in Richard Williams' studio in London for 8 months, coaching his animator. Well, this kid that was here tonight was over there at that time. And Dick wanted me to stay longer, and I thought, well, I've been away from home quite a while, and I always wanted to, I finally got myself independent enough to survive, and I always wanted to paint, and so I thought I better do it now because I'm not sure of any painting classes up there. So I decided to do what I could on my own, and I have done some painting, of course, for 3 years over in Vienna. It was nothing but painting all day long, and first one whole year of portrait and a whole year of nude, and then all summer long we went out into this old countryside and sketched towns that were built in 1600 or something like that. And as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have a job when I got back, and I sold every one of those sketches, and they led to a few painting jobs. But I'm a fairly good draftsman. I wouldn't have done the Snow White character if I were not. But I've been drawing characters that are not classical, but giving them the little twist. It's hard to describe because most of your pointillistic painters or your impressionists usually do landscapes or something like that. And I'm trying to do impressionistic figures. They are a little cartoony. They're a little bit swingy, like those drawings I gave you. Some of those are fairly well drawn figures. They're close enough that if you put a real face on them instead of a cartoon face, they made them proper size. Of course, Michelangelo made his figures 8 heads high. I'm sticking to 8 heads high because he wasn't an amateur. I figured that what's good enough for Michelangelo is good enough for me. Bridgman, who was a little short, fat guy, he used to make his figures about 5 heads high.
Because he was short and fat.
But no, 8 heads is a very, you can cheat, but sometimes I like to have a small head and then build the hair up. And I'll send a few photostats up and you can photograph them and sneak them in one of your shows. And, but I've got, how? Somebody ask a question?
No, I was just telling Reg, you should see your apartment on the walls.
Well, the apartment's nothing to look at, but I never had time to straighten it. But I've enjoyed it. And I really, I'm glad that I did the study. I'm glad that I had the animation, and I'm sure, as a matter of fact, 2 or 3 people, Bill Melendez, who does the
Charlie Brown.
Does the Charlie Brown things. Do you get those pictures up here?
Oh,
on TV?
yeah. Oh, yeah.
He said, I want to buy the first picture you make. Well, Bill is in the chips. He's got plenty of dough. Other people have said they want to buy the first one. I painted a few, but I don't want to sell them. I'm not quite. But I think I'm right there where I can do pretty close to what I wish to do. I don't feel like an amateur. I'm a little above that. And the figure, of course, is very different than making a lot of triangles and tying them together. I wouldn't get any, I use that sort of thing for background.
He's not talking about the male figure.
That's what?
You're not talking about the male figure.
Oh, the male figure, what about him?
I said you're not talking about that. The
No.
ones you're drawing are beautiful, beautiful.
Well,
Classy girls.
I have male ballet dancers in there. They look a little like females. I put whiskers on them.
May I ask another question? Have you heard of the studio here in Toronto called Nelvana? The animation studio?
I have heard it. I know nothing about it.
It's just that they are one of the very few studios doing good full animation.
Yeah.
You know, as you know, of course, not by many.
No, well, we have a few who are doing. Of course, Richard Williams primarily, and there's a fellow, a friend of mine, and also one of my former assistants, Dwayne Crowther, has a studio in Hollywood, actually in Santa Monica, called the Duck Soup Studio, and he does primarily full animation. And he does some pretty nice jobs.
So there's still some around.
Yeah, of course, it's a misfortune that Hanna-Barbera now are trying to do Heidi, and that is what they will call full animation. And
what's it going to be like?
Wow.
yeah, well, the trouble is to do good full animation, you've got to be a good full animator. I mean, you have to know.
And last related is that I just read that Hanna-Barbera were planning to bring the Flintstones back to primetime TV and all that. Well, the originals weren't bad by Hanna-Barbera standards, but the new ones, I'd like to see them. Man, either primetime will do something to make it better, or for that matter, primetime TV is going so bad now that I'm not sure. This way, I think they'll probably bomb. One thing's on NBC, so it'll bomb.
Well, Sure.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to be. I've never changed. I am probably look at more of it than I should, but I enjoy it. And there are groups, as this Fantasy Fair group, who are really devoted to animation. And gosh, they said I ran. They had some shots. They had Betty Boop's there, and then some shots that I had done in Snow White that were strictly my animation. And gosh, they gave me a real standing ovation, which I never received before, unless I missed something.
We'll have the shots from Snow White tomorrow night.
Everybody's contemporaries here. I didn't have to pay much in there.
Well, yeah, I know.
Well, I think it's great. I think you've got a marvelous thing going here, and gosh, it's worth keeping up. Eventually, of course, Disney does. They've lost that great group of animators that they just they didn't see. See, when Walt died, nobody there realized that Walt had spent years accumulating this marvelous group. I went through the Disney. I was curious to see how many of them were Eastern artists, and in writing one of these things that I wrote for the cartoonist profile, and so I went through the list of names, which is not complete. A lot of very good animators are not in that Disney listing in the, what do they call it, the index or whatever it is. And there were 15 of them. When I landed in the Disney studio, including myself, there were 15 who were top animators in the New York area. And in that period, Walt had added perhaps a similar group of talented people himself. He built one building that housed 200 people who were learning how to become assistants, and he really was spending money on it. And then he did things like letting us experiment with a character like Snow White, and if something we didn't like, we had to okay a character to sign our initials before we really had to animate. And I remember one eagle that had too many feathers on it in the Alpine Climbers. Did you ever see that picture? Mickey's Alpine Climbers. I guess that was the title. So I asked the designers to simplify that wing. The eagle had to do a lot of flying. So they limited the number of feathers, which made it possible to animate it. So the same was true even of characters like Snow White. And those animators are not born. They're born with the talent and the indication of becoming animators. It takes a lot of mixing of other ingredients before they come up with a full talent. And they're just finding that, and they're searching Canada viciously to try to find talent. In fact, one of the new animators that I met over there was from Canada. I've forgotten his name, but he had to have a lot of talent before they put him on. They're really in trouble now.
They recently lost a bunch of people, didn't they?
Oh, yes.
That's
Well,
16.
16?
all of the 9 old men are virtually retired. Mark Davis switched over into designing the characters for these auto animation that they have in
Small
film.
world.
Right, the audio animatronics.
Yeah. And Eric Larson is still there, but I guess all the others, Milt is gone. A couple of them have died. Les Clark died a short time ago.
They had some defections. They're younger people too.
Well, that's
Yeah.
Blues.
Yes.
Blues took a whole bunch of them with
Right,
him when he
yeah.
left.
I'm wondering if you have hope for the future of animation. Do you think there's enough people learning from the old ones that are still around?
There are more people in Canada and the United States than there were 10 years ago. They ought to find enough talented people. I'm sure the talent is here, but somebody is really, but Walt just combed them out, you know. I made one picture with Betty Boop on it, and the next morning I got a phone call, and Roy came out and spent a whole week with me trying to persuade me to come and work for Walt. And at the same time, however, iWorks had contacted me, and as I said earlier, we had an idea at that time. iWorks was the animator, but we had not learned enough about Walt to realize that he had other talents that really built. He built the first real story groups. The others came later. And the story thing was one of the things that became just as important as any. You take the little scene which is in this group of Snow White and the Dwarfs, where she's kissing them goodbye when they're going back to work the following morning. And Grumpy doesn't want to be kissed, and she finally kisses him, and boy, he goes into a spin, and he's mad at himself, and he starts off and gets his nose caught in the knothole in a tree, and he starts off again and lands in a brook and splashes water all over him. They topped one gag with another just to build up a story, never got. There were 30 of the best animators in the entire world out of, how many are there, 3 billion people on Earth, or something like that, and Walt had the 30 best, and he had 200 trainees over there learning how to catch up.
Teaching them the word, I guess.
Yeah, well, fellows like Mark Davis would come over, and I thought, boy, what am I going to... I had a few assistants that simply couldn't do it, And Mark came over, and you always had to go along with it. They made a very careful selection, and the man in charge over there knew what everybody could do. And I think probably they started them on doing in-betweens on the character before they picked him. Because Mark moved in there, and boy, it was like having 2 right arms. I just loved it.
Actually, Reg, he could go on for hours and hours and hours. I took him to the bank in North Hollywood the other day, and I counted 6 places where he said, "Oh, I used to live there. I used to live there." Close to UPA, Warner's, and
Well,
place
if you
else.
don't pay your rent, you gotta leave somewhere.
But I do think he should stay.
Yes, and speaking about paying the rent, we're trying gently to keep this thing on a level where we can do what we're doing right now. And there are people here who are going to say, I wish the hell this guy wouldn't say what he's going to say. But we could do this and have a large room full of comic book dealers and science fiction dealers. You've all been there, and you know that this is not what you get. Now, what Grim did was he did a special drawing of Betty Boop. We prepared that on parchment. It's a limited edition, and it's $25, and Grim will sign them on Sunday. Or if you leave your name now, Grim can do it in his spare time later. We'd very much appreciate it if you would do that. If you can do that, it would be a great help. Look at the size of that theater in there, look at the size of the people here, and just figure out, and if it means a lot to you, think of the next time, and we want them up here again. And it's up to you to help us bring them back up here next time. Okay? Let's have a big hand.